Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. It's been a little while since my last video, mainly because of another channel that I have called Ottawa Valley Rambles, but today I'm going to be talking about the Sony A7IV. I'm hardly the first person to be talking about this camera, but hopefully I'll have something new for you. Let's get right to it. This really isn't a review of the A7IV, but more of an appreciation of some of the new features that have come along over the last few years since the A7 III. Personally, I use the A7R IV and the A7R III for both photography and video, and I've had quite a bit of frustration with it, one being that there's no 10-bit video and that sort of thing. So I'd like to go through right now is all of these new features that have come out. First, I'm going to start off with all of the features that are used in both photo and video. The first thing that I noticed when using this camera is that the autofocus and the overall speed of the camera is quite a bit faster than my A7R IV. The autofocus, while it's very reliable on the A7R IV, it's where it falls apart is in low light conditions and when there's a lot of extreme backlight. What I've managed to do with the A7IV is shoot in light as low as when I'm using f1.8 at 1/160th of a second and 12,800 ISO. So basically when you can no longer see the facial features of someone and it still catches the eye to focus when using it in those conditions. I've also taken the video into a completely dark room where I can't actually see what I'm looking at, and then when I go back and review the video, I notice that the camera is actually focusing in the dark and it's in focus after I've cranked up everything so that I can see it on the video afterwards. Very impressive. Another very important feature that, especially for us hybrid shooters or those of us who shoot both photo and video, is the separation of the functions of photography and videography. The first thing that you notice on the top of the camera is a dial that allows you to switch between the two. But also when you go into the menus after switching between photo and video, you can see that the functions are oriented towards whichever function you're trying to use between photo and video, as you can see on the menu items that I'm showing right now. Previously, when I was shooting photos and videos with the A7R IV, I would have to pick one or the other because switching between the two was too confusing, and there were a few functions, for example, picture profiles, that when you're switching from photo to video, it would retain the functions that are only applicable to photography or videography. Now with the function buttons separated, you can have 3 separate function or memory functions that apply strictly to photography and strictly to videography. So you have 6 in total. That allows you to just switch back and forth between the two. The next feature that's very useful when you're using this camera is the flip out screen. In the old A7R IV, well, it seems funny to call it old, but it is in my case. In the A7R IV, it's really oriented towards landscape-oriented photography, so that if you're holding the camera lower like this, you can look down at it and still see what's in front of you. To some degree, you can hold it above your head and see what you're looking at as well, but it's not a 90-degree angle to the camera, so you get an oblique view or a 45-degree angle view when you have it over your head. It works, but it's not great. More importantly, when you're photographing something in a portrait orientation, there was no way to flip the screen out so that you could see what you're looking at low to the ground when you're trying to photograph something. Now you can actually hold the camera, flip the LCD straight up towards you when you're in portrait orientation and see exactly what's in front of you so that you can focus or choose focus points while you're doing that. Very, very handy. The other obvious benefit when you're shooting videography with this ability is that you can actually point the LCD directly towards you so that you can see what you're doing. In fact, I'm using that at the moment. I'm looking straight at myself beside the camera, as well as having my Monitor Plus working here so I can start and stop the camera, but all of this feedback helps me to keep everything on track. Now, speaking of the speed of the camera, the boot up time of the camera has changed significantly. Anytime you'd pull a battery out of the A7R IV and put it back in and turn it on, you'd have about somewhere between a 3 and 5 second delay before the camera was ready to use. When you're in the middle of a wedding ceremony and your battery is low and you're trying to switch batteries and then get shooting again, a 5-second delay is very stressful. I'll show you on screen what it looks like between the two, but the difference when you're using the A7IV is that it boots up very quickly when you're changing batteries, but even its startup time from being in sleep mode or from being turned off is basically the time that it turn it on and hold it up to your face, it's already ready to go. Definitely not the case with the A7R4. Again, with the speed of the camera in mind, the formatting time for formatting a card when you're prepping your camera is significantly reduced with the A7IV compared to the A7R4. I didn't expect something like this, but it's quite a relief when you're setting it up for the first time. And finally, another added bonus, which I wasn't expecting in this case, was the addition of seconds when it comes to the internal time of the clock for when you're setting it. When you're trying to match two cameras together and you can see the seconds, you can get them perfectly matched so that when you're using or viewing all of the photos afterwards, they'll be in chronological order. Now let's talk about photo-specific items that are different between the A7IV and the A7R4. The first thing that I noticed when I was using this camera is that the image size, or the file size rather, is quite a bit smaller on the A7IV. Now, one is 61 megapixels, the A7R4, and the other is 33 for the A7IV. So this makes a huge difference in the file size and the write speed to the cards and downloading them and everything. So while it's nice to have 61 megapixels once in a while when you're shooting commercial work or portraits, I much prefer to have the 33 megapixels of the A7IV when I'm shooting something like a wedding. It means my write speed is much faster and just storage of all of the images and everything's a lot faster and takes up a lot less space. I actually really appreciate this because it's quite cumbersome to shoot 2,000 61 megapixel files and have to archive them and deal with them being so much slower. I haven't actually heard anything about the IBIS improving that much when it comes to photography, because it actually is quite a bit more noticeable when you're using video because you have active stabilization. But the IBIS itself seems to have improved quite a bit. The other day I tried with a 135mm lens and I was able to shoot handheld at 1/15 of a second and have no motion blur from me. The subject is different, of course, but at least I'm not getting any shake from myself. I was very surprised by this because the A7IV is not nearly as forgiving and you have to shoot at relatively high shutter speeds to make sure that you don't have any camera shake. Another thing that I really did not expect was the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth speed of the A7IV compared to the A7R4. I have applications like Imaging Edge and Monitor Plus so that I can see what I'm doing and shoot remotely. But on A7R4, it's just basically useless because the latency on the camera versus what I see on my phone is just so slow. With this camera, it's almost less than a quarter of a second. I'm just looking at myself speaking on here on Monitor Plus, and it's fully usable so that I can use it as much as I want. I'm going to be using that all the time now. Now again, in the category of things I really didn't expect, one of the biggest annoyances as a photographer when you're previewing your RAW files from the A7R4 and basically every camera that I've ever had from Sony is that the images themselves are about 1,060 pixels across, so they're very low resolution, and when you're looking at them on a large screen and trying to figure out which images you're going to keep based on which ones are actually in focus, this is not useful at all. They all look soft. The new A7IV files have a full-sized preview file that you see right away if you're using something like Photo Mechanic. So if you look on screen, you'll see right away that the image is full 33 megapixels. The preview is 33 megapixels, which was not the case in any other Sony camera that I've had. This is a much appreciated benefit that I've heard nothing about. One of the biggest features that I was looking forward to when getting this camera, and the main reason why I bought it actually, was for 10-bit video. I've been shooting video with the A7R4 in 8 bits for the last year or so. And while it's much better than anything else I had, it's also problematic when it comes to grading and editing the photos. If you're trying to use something like S-Log3 or any of the other flat profiles, you'll notice that you get banding in the sky or any area that has a very slow gradation in color. You definitely don't get this when you're using 10-bit video, and also when you're bringing up the shadows in any of your video, you're not getting the same kind of noise that you'll get in 8-bit. This is one of the biggest benefits I've had after having used this for 2 weeks. Another big highlight feature that people have been talking about is the 4K 60 ability of the A7 IV. Yes, it's cropped when you're shooting in 4K 60, which is a problem for some people, but for my purposes, which is something I seldom use, 4K 60 is just appreciated. I wouldn't even care if I didn't have it, but it's nice to have it. As I mentioned before about the IBIS being better with photography, another thing that we have now with video is active stabilization. Active stabilization is just a digital stabilization that's an added bonus on top of the optical or sensor stabilization that is incorporated into the body of the A7 IV. It's not something that always works great, but it's a big step up from just having regular stabilization. It's very useful for doing handheld shots and keeping them nice and smooth. I wouldn't go as far as saying that it's great for walking photos or anything like that, although it's not bad, but it's much better than it used to be. It does have a bit of a crop though, but it's not that big of a deal. Another thing that I didn't expect, and apparently it's in the A7R IV, but I really appreciate in this, is clear zoom. Because I'm using a large sensor on this, it's larger than the video size required, and because I'm sampling from a 7K image, it allows me to use a zoom up to 0.5 extra reach, so my 21mm will turn into a 32mm, and it allows me to zoom in by that amount without any degradation in quality. You might see a little bit of difference in low light situations because the noise might increase, but in the case for mine, for how I use it, I don't have any problems with it. It's just an added bonus to be able to zoom in a little bit without any degradation. And then finally, the one little thing that I've really enjoyed having is the record button on the top of the camera. It's not the case in any other camera that I've had, but having it on top allows me to see it, especially if I'm in front of it. It's a big helpful thing to have, and it allows me to set the record much easier than it would if it was in the back. If I'm facing the camera away from me, I don't mind having it on the back, but when it's facing towards me, I'd much rather have it on the top like it is. The only thing I have to say that kind of annoys me is one of the custom function buttons is right beside it. So if you're not looking at it, you can often click on the custom function button instead of the record button. It is a bit problematic once in a while, but it's something I'll get used to. So that about covers it for my list of bonus features that I've discovered using the A7 IV over the last 2 weeks. I'd be interested to hear if there's anything that I missed that you've really enjoyed using with this camera compared to a camera that you've had previously. If you found anything useful or entertaining in this video, please feel free to subscribe to my channel or give me a like for this particular video, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks very much. See you later.